Sometimes a man rides into the wilderness not to find himself, but to disappear forever. That's exactly what Jedediah Crane had in mind when he arrived at an abandoned cabin high in the Montana mountains with nothing but his loyal dog and a lifetime of sorrow weighing on his shoulders. He was looking for a quiet place to live out his final years, far from the memories that haunted him. But one evening, something impossible happened. A young girl stepped out from the trees, moving alongside a pack of wolves like they were family. She wasn't a captive or a victim. She had been raised by these wolves since she was a baby, living wild and free in a world most people could never understand. What would happen when their two worlds collided? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed. The journey to the high country had taken Jedediah Crane 4 days on horseback, each mile carrying him further from the life he'd known, and deeper into a solitude he both craved and feared. At 63 years old, his body bore the map of a hard life, knees that complained on cold mornings, hands gnarled from decades of working traplines, a back that remembered every fall from every ornery mule he'd ever known. His face was weathered leather, creased deep around eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile somewhere along the way. The cabin sat in a clearing at the edge of the timberline, where the lodgepole pines gave way to scraggly whitebark, and the wind carried the sharp scent of high elevation. It had belonged to an old trapper named Silas Dutton, who'd worked these mountains for 30 years before his heart gave out one winter. Silas had no family, no heirs, just a handwritten will, leaving the place to any soul brave or foolish enough to want it. Jed figured he qualified as both. The structure wasn't much to look at. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney listing slightly to the north, a roof of hand-split shakes that had seen better decades. But it was solid enough, built by a man who understood that up here, at nearly 9,000 feet, a poorly made shelter was a death sentence. The single room measured maybe 15 feet square, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a crude wooden bunk built into another, and a few shelves that sagged under the weight of dust and mouse droppings. Jed's dog, a blue heeler named Rufus, had bounded into the cabin ahead of him, working overtime as he investigated every corner. The dog was 11 years old, getting grey around the muzzle, but he still had the energy of a pup when something interested him. Rufus had been Jed's constant companion since his wife Sarah passed. The one living thing that seemed to understand grief didn't have a timeline. That some mornings getting out of bed was an act of pure willpower. Sarah had been gone 3 years now. 3 years, 2 months and 16 days, if Jed was counting. And he was always counting. Cancer had taken her slow and mean, stealing her piece by piece until the woman he loved was just a shadow in a bed, her hand in his growing lighter every day. Toward the end, she'd made him promise not to waste away in their house in Kalispell, not to turn their home into a shrine to her memory. "Go live, Jed," she'd whispered, her voice barely there. "Find some peace up in those mountains you always loved. Don't let my dying be the last thing you do." He'd tried to honor that promise, really tried. But the house had too many ghosts. Her coffee cup still in the cabinet, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her garden tools in the shed waiting for hands that would never hold them again. The town had too many pitying looks, too many well-meaning neighbors asking how he was doing when they both knew there was no good answer to that question. So when he'd heard about Silas Dutton's place through a friend of a friend, Jed had sold everything that mattered and packed what was left onto 2 mules and his old sorrel mare. Copper! The first week at the cabin had been all work. Jed patched the roof where animals had torn through, replaced the rotted floorboards near the door, cleared the chimney of a bird's nest, and scrubbed years of grime off every surface. He repaired the corral fence for Copper and built a small lean-to for the mules. He cut and stacked firewood until his back screamed and his hands blistered. Because up here winter came early and stayed late. And running out of wood meant running out of life. Rufus had adjusted quickly as dogs do. He spent his days exploring the surrounding forest, chasing squirrels he'd never catch, and returning at dusk with burrs in his coat and satisfaction in his eyes. At night, he'd curl up by the fire, his presence a comfort that didn't require conversation or explanation. Sometimes Jed would talk to him, rambling thoughts about Sarah, about the years they'd had, about the children they'd never been able to have. Rufus would listen with those intelligent eyes, never judging, never offering false comfort. The mountains themselves were a presence Jed had forgotten the weight of. He'd trapped these ranges in his younger days, before Sarah, before settling down to run a hardware store in town. Back then, the wilderness had felt like freedom, endless, wild, indifferent to human troubles. Now it felt different, heavier somehow. The silence up here wasn't peaceful. It was absolute. At night, when the fire burned low and the darkness pressed against the cabin walls, Jed could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the creak of his joints when he shifted position. Sometimes he wondered if this was what dying would feel like, gradual fading into that vast silence, until there was nothing left but wind through the pines. He'd established a routine, because routine was what kept a man sane in solitude. Up at first light, coffee boiled strong and black in a dented pot, breakfast of fried salt pork and day-old biscuits. Then he'd check his small trapline, a dozen sets within a few miles of the cabin, mostly for marten and fox. The pelts weren't worth much anymore, but the work gave his days structure. Afternoons were for chores, cutting wood, hauling water from the creek, maintaining his gear, tending to Copper and the mules. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the quiet became oppressive, when his thoughts would spiral back to Sarah, to the life he'd had, to the emptiness that waited for him now. He'd seen evidence of wolves almost immediately, tracks in the mud near the creek, scat on the game trails, the distant howling at night that made Rufus's ears prick up and a low growl rumble in his chest. Jed wasn't worried. He'd lived around wolves before and knew they generally avoided humans. But there was something about these wolves, something in the frequency and boldness of their presence that felt different, unnatural almost. One morning, checking a trap near a beaver pond, he'd found it sprung and empty, the bait gone and tracks all around. Wolf tracks, but also something else. Smaller prints, barefoot, human-sized but not quite human in their distribution and gait. Jed had knelt there in the frost-stiff grass, studying those tracks with a growing unease. They led to the wolf prints and away from them, sometimes overlapping, sometimes parallel. Like whoever made them had been walking with the wolves. Running with them, he'd mentioned it to no one because there was no one to mention it to. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles down the mountain, a sheep rancher named Horace Blackwell, who Jed had met exactly once when he'd ridden through Blackwell's property on his way up. Horace had been cordial but distant, the way mountain people often are with newcomers. He'd warned Jed about the winters, about the wolves, about something he'd called the wild thing that lived up in the high timber. Jed had nodded politely, assuming it was local superstition. The kind of tales that grew in isolated places where long winters made men see things that weren't there. But those tracks had been real. And over the following weeks, Jed had found more evidence. A cache of bones near his trapline, picked clean and arranged in a way that suggested intelligence, purpose. Scratches on trees at odd heights. And once, just once, the feeling of being watched so intensely that he'd spun around with his rifle raised, only to see nothing but forest shadows and the judging eyes of a raven perched in a dead snag. Rufus had noticed too. The dog had become increasingly alert, spending more time on the cabin's porch, head up and nose working the breeze. Sometimes he'd whine low in his throat, a sound of confusion rather than fear. Once he'd barked furiously at the tree line for a full minute before Jed could call him down. And even then the dog had remained tense, hackles raised, staring at something Jed couldn't see. The cabin had one small window facing east, and Jed had taken to sitting there in the evenings, watching the light fade from the high peaks and the shadows pool in the valleys below. It was during one of these vigils, 3 weeks into his occupancy, that he saw them clearly for the first time. A pack of wolves emerged from the timber just after sunset, 7 of them, moving in that loose formation that wolves use when they're not hunting, just traveling. They were beautiful animals, big and rangy, their coats shading from silver grey to near black, moving with the confidence of creatures that owned this land long before humans had ever thought to claim it. And with them, moving as naturally as if she were part of the pack, was a girl. She was young. Jed guessed maybe 16 or 17, though it was hard to tell at that distance. She wore what looked like buckskin or leather, crude garments that covered her modestly but left her arms and legs mostly bare despite the evening chill. Her hair was long and dark, tangled with what might have been feathers or bones. She moved on all 4 sometimes, loping alongside the wolves with an easy grace, then rising to walk upright with a gait that was somehow both human and not. Jed had frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, his breath caught in his chest. He watched until the pack and the girl disappeared into the darkening forest, and even then he sat motionless, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. A wild child, a feral human. The stories existed in frontier history, children lost or abandoned, raised by animals, becoming something in between. But they were always stories, legends, cautionary tales. Not real, not here, not now. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees and Rufus pressed against his leg, listening to the wolves howl their ancient songs in the darkness beyond his walls. The sound was closer than it had ever been, almost surrounding the cabin, and within it, Jed thought he could hear something else, a voice high and wild, that might have been human once, but had forgotten how to be. When dawn finally came, grey and cold with the promise of the first real snow, Jed stepped outside to find tracks everywhere. Wolf prints circled the cabin, the corral, the woodpile, and among them, those other prints, small, bare, human feet that had walked right up to his door, paused there, then retreated back into the wild. He spent that day in a fog of disbelief and wonder. Part of him wanted to dismiss what he'd seen, to chalk it up to failing light and an old man's imagination. But the tracks were real. The evidence was undeniable. Somewhere up in these mountains, a girl lived with wolves, had been raised by them, if the stories Horace had hinted at were true. And for some reason, she'd come to investigate him, the newest intruder in her territory. Jed found himself thinking about Sarah, about what she would have said. She'd always had a soft heart for strays, bringing home injured birds, feeding the neighborhood cats, volunteering at the children's home in town. "Everything deserves a chance, Jed," she'd say. "Everything deserves someone to see it, really see it, and care." He could almost hear her voice now, could almost feel her hand on his shoulder, urging him towards something he didn't quite understand yet. That evening, as the light began to fail again, Jed did something that surprised even himself. He took a tin plate from the cabin, loaded it with salt pork, biscuits, and some dried apples, and set it on a flat rock about 30 yards from the cabin door. Then he retreated inside, leaving the door cracked open, and waited. The wolves came as full dark settled. He could hear them before he saw them. The soft padding of feet, the occasional huff of breath, the click of claws on stone. Rufus tensed beside him but didn't bark, sensing perhaps that this moment required silence. Through the crack in the door, Jed watched as the pack approached the offering. They circled it, sniffed it, but didn't touch it. And then she appeared. The girl moved into the small circle of moonlight with a caution that was purely animal. She dropped to all fours, approaching the plate with her head low, testing the air. Then, with a quick movement that startled him, she snatched a piece of meat and retreated several steps, watching the cabin with eyes that caught the light and threw it back. Wolf eyes, almost in a human face. She ate quickly, efficiently, then took the rest of the food and disappeared into the darkness. The wolves followed, melting into the forest like smoke, and Jed was left standing in his doorway, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. Who was she? How had she come to be here? How long had she lived this way? And most troubling of all, what was he supposed to do about it? He didn't have answers that night, or the next, or the next. But something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a place to hide from the world, to wait out his remaining years in quiet grief. Suddenly, impossibly, it felt like the edge of a mystery that needed solving, a life that needed understanding, maybe even saving. And for the first time since Sarah had died, Jed felt something stir in his chest that wasn't just pain or regret. It was curiosity, purpose, the faint, fragile beginning of something that might, if he was careful, grow into hope. The pattern continued for 5 nights. Jed would set out food at dusk, always the same spot, always a mix of whatever he had on hand. The girl would come with her pack, always cautious, always quick. She'd take what she wanted and vanish back into the darkness. Jed never tried to approach, never made a sound. He simply watched and waited, learning her rhythms, her habits, the way she moved through the world. On the 6th night, everything changed. Jed had just placed the evening's offering, venison from a deer he'd brought down that morning, along with some pan bread still warm from the fire, when he heard something that froze his blood. Not the usual wolf howls, but something else. Gunfire, 3 sharp cracks echoing from down the mountain, maybe 2 miles distant, followed by men's voices raised in excitement. Rufus started barking, a frantic sound that spoke of danger sensed but not understood. Jed grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The voices were getting closer, crashing through the underbrush with none of the quiet grace of the wolves. Then he heard it, a yelp of pain, distinctly canine, followed by more shots. They were hunting the pack. The girl appeared at the edge of the clearing without warning, moving faster than Jed had ever seen her move. But this time she wasn't alone. She was dragging something. A wolf, one of the younger ones from the pack, blood matting its fur along its left haunch. The animal whimpered and struggled weakly, clearly in pain, but still alive. Behind her, 3 men burst from the trees. They were rough-looking types, dressed in worn canvas and leather, carrying rifles, and bearing the cocksure attitude of men who believed the wilderness belonged to them by right of firepower. The one in front, a barrel-chested man with a black beard shot through with grey, pulled up short when he saw Jed standing on the porch. "Evening," the man called out, his tone friendly enough but his eyes hard. "Name's Cutter. We're tracking a wolf pack that's been taking sheep from the valley. That girl there," he gestured with his rifle toward where the girl crouched protectively over the wounded wolf. "She's been living rough up here. We'll take her back down to town where she belongs, along with that wolf." Jed felt something tight and hot coil in his chest. The girl was staring at him now, her eyes wide and wild with fear and something else, a desperate, pleading look that seemed to say she understood exactly what these men represented. Death, captivity, the end of the only life she knew. "The girl stays here," Jed heard himself say. His voice was calm, measured, but his hands tightened on his rifle. "And the wolf, too. This is my land, and they're under my protection." Cutter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, old-timer, I don't think you understand the situation. That pack has killed sheep down in the valley. There's a bounty on them. And that girl, she's been lost for years. There's folks in Thornwood who've been looking for her. She's not property," Jed said quietly. "She's a human being, and she's not going anywhere." The 2 men flanking Cutter shifted their stances, their hands moving to their rifles. Jed recognized the signs. This was about to turn violent. "You're making a mistake, old man," Cutter said, his voice dropping low and dangerous.
"We're 3-1.
"Stand aside." Jed raised his rifle an inch, not quite aiming but making his intention clear. "First man who moves toward that girl or that wolf gets a bullet." The standoff held for a long moment, tension crackling in the air. Rufus was still barking. The wounded wolf whimpered. And the girl, she just watched Jed with those strange, wild eyes, as if trying to understand why this old man would risk his life for her. Then, from the forest behind the 3 hunters, came a sound that changed everything. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rest of the pack emerged from the trees, 6 adult wolves spreading out in a loose semicircle behind the men. The hunters were now caught between Jed's rifle and a pack of wolves protecting their own. Cutter's face went pale. He glanced back at the wolves, then at Jed. "This ain't over," he finally spat. "We'll be back with more men." He gestured to his companions, and they began backing away slowly, keeping their rifles ready. The pack watched them go until the men had disappeared into the forest. Only when silence returned did the pack relax. They padded forward, surrounding the girl and the injured wolf, nuzzling and whining. The girl stroked the wounded animal's head, making soft sounds that weren't quite words, but seemed to comfort the creature. Jed lowered his rifle slowly, his heart still hammering. What had he just done? He'd threatened 3 armed men over a feral girl and a wild animal. He'd made enemies of people who clearly had resources and determination. But when the girl looked up at him again, something in her expression had changed. The wariness was still there, but beneath it was something new. Recognition, or the first fragile seed of trust. She stood slowly, leaving the injured wolf to the ministrations of the pack. She took one step toward Jed, then another, her movements careful and deliberate. Rufus had stopped barking and was watching with intense interest. When she was about 10 feet away, the girl stopped. She looked at Jed, really looked at him, her head tilting. Then she did something that nearly broke his heart. She reached out one hand, palm up, in a gesture that was unmistakably human. A gesture of peace, of thanks. Jed felt his throat tighten. He lowered his rifle completely, leaning it against the porch rail. Then, moving as carefully as he would approach a spooked horse, he stepped down from the porch and extended his own hand. They stood there for a long moment, 2 hands reaching across the space between wild and tame. Jed didn't try to touch her. That would have been too much. But the gesture itself was enough. The wounded wolf whimpered again, breaking the moment. The girl turned back to her pack, dropping to her knees beside the injured animal. She looked back at Jed once more, and in her eyes he saw a question, a plea. "Bring him here," Jed said softly, gesturing toward the cabin. "I can help." He didn't know if she understood his words, but she seemed to understand his meaning. She made a sound, a low, complex vocalization, and the pack responded. 2 of the larger wolves carefully lifted the injured one between them, supporting him as they moved toward the cabin. Jed opened the cabin door wide, and for the first time in its long history, wolves entered. They moved cautiously, sniffing everything. Rufus retreated to the corner, uncertain but not aggressive. Jed quickly cleared space near the fire and spread out an old blanket. The wolves lowered their injured companion onto it, then stepped back. The girl knelt beside the wounded animal, her hand never leaving his fur. "Let me see," Jed said gently, kneeling beside them. The girl tensed but didn't move away. Carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones, Jed examined the wound. The bullet had grazed the wolf's haunch, tearing through muscle but missing bone. Painful, but not fatal if he could prevent infection. He fetched his medical kit, an old army surplus box that had seen him through countless injuries over the years. As he worked, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made the wolf yelp, then binding it with strips of clean cloth, the girl watched his every move with absolute attention. She was learning, he realized. When he finished, Jed sat back. The wounded wolf's breathing had steadied. The rest of the pack had settled around the fire. And the girl, she was looking at Jed with something that might have been wonder. "You're safe here," Jed told her, not knowing if she understood but needing to say it anyway. "Those men won't get you." "Not while I'm breathing." She tilted her head, processing. Then slowly, she reached out and touched his hand. Just a brief contact, her fingers rough against his weathered skin. But it was deliberate, a thank you in the only language she had. And in that moment, sitting on the floor of a mountain cabin with a pack of wolves and a wild girl, Jed felt something shift deep inside him. The grief that had weighted him down for 3 years suddenly felt less like an anchor. Sarah's death had hollowed him out, but maybe this strange new purpose could begin to fill that space. He'd come to these mountains to disappear. Instead, he'd found something impossible, something that needed him. And for the first time since he'd watched them lower Sarah's coffin into the frozen ground, Jed felt like he had a reason to see tomorrow. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of snow. Winter was coming early, and with it would come challenges he couldn't yet imagine. Cutter and his men would be back. The girl's past would eventually catch up to them, but tonight none of that mattered. Tonight, a wounded wolf was healing by his fire. A wild girl had chosen to trust him, and a lonely old man had remembered what it felt like to matter. The girl and her pack stayed through the night. Jed had expected them to leave once the wounded wolf was stable, to retreat back into the wilderness. But as the hours passed and the fire burned down to embers, they remained. The wolves arranged themselves in a loose circle around the injured one, their bodies providing warmth and protection. The girl curled up beside the wounded animal, one hand resting on his flank, her breathing eventually falling into the slow rhythm of sleep. Jed sat in his chair near the door, his rifle across his lap, watching over them all. Rufus had eventually overcome his uncertainty and now lay near the fire, close enough to the wolves to be part of the group but maintaining a respectful distance. The old man found himself marveling at the scene. Wild creatures sleeping peacefully in a human dwelling, trusting enough to lower their guard. As dawn light began to filter through the small window, the girl stirred. She opened her eyes, dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and immediately checked on the wounded wolf. The animal was still sleeping, his breathing steady, the bandage holding. She seemed satisfied and rose to a crouch, her movements silent and fluid. Jed cleared his throat softly. "Morning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your friend there, he's going to be fine. Wound's clean. He just needs rest now." The girl tilted her head, that characteristic gesture that made her seem both curious and cautious. She didn't respond with words. Jed was beginning to wonder if she could speak at all. But she made a soft sound, almost a hum that seemed to acknowledge his words. Slowly, Jed stood and moved to the fireplace. He stirred the coals back to life and hung his coffee pot over the flames. "You hungry?" he asked, glancing back at the girl. She was watching him with intense interest. He opened his food stores and pulled out some dried venison, hard biscuits, and a precious jar of honey. He laid them out on the table, then stepped back. The girl approached cautiously, moving on all fours. She picked up a piece of venison, sniffed it, then took a small bite. Her eyes widened slightly. She ate quickly, efficiently, tearing the meat with her teeth. But when she reached for the honey, something changed. She dipped her finger in it, tasted it, and made a sound that was unmistakably delighted. A small, breathy laugh that was so human it made Jed's chest tighten. "You like that, do you?" he said, unable to keep the smile from his face. "Honey special. Got that from a beekeeper down in Thornwood last fall." Over the next few days, a tentative routine developed. The girl and her pack would leave at dawn, disappearing into the forest for hours. Jed would tend to his traplines, cut wood, maintain the cabin. But every evening, as the light faded, they would return. The wounded wolf was healing remarkably well, and by the third day he was putting weight on the injured leg, though he still limped. The girl began to linger longer each visit. She would sit on the porch steps while Jed worked nearby, watching him with that intense, studying gaze. Sometimes he would talk to her, rambling thoughts about the weather, about his day, about Sarah. He didn't expect her to understand, but the act of speaking seemed to put her at ease. On the fourth day, Jed tried something new. He'd been repairing a section of fence when one of the wolves, a large grey male that seemed to be the pack's leader, approached him. The animal stopped about 15 feet away, regarding Jed with intelligent yellow eyes. The old man froze, hardly daring to breathe. Then slowly he set down his hammer and extended his hand, palm down. The wolf watched him for a long moment, then took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough that Jed could feel the heat from his coat. The wolf sniffed his hand thoroughly, then allowed him to touch the top of his head. The fur was coarse and thick. The wolf tolerated the contact for perhaps 10 seconds before stepping back and trotting away. Jed released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The girl had been watching from the porch, and when he looked at her, he saw something that might have been approval in her expression. That evening, Jed decided it was time to attempt something more ambitious. After the meal, which the girl now took sitting at the table rather than crouched on the floor, he fetched a slate and some chalk he'd found among Silas Dutton's possessions. He sat down across from her and drew a simple shape, a circle. "This is a circle," he said, tapping the slate. Then he handed her the chalk. The girl took the chalk awkwardly, holding it in her fist like a child might. She stared at the slate, clearly uncertain. Jed guided her hand gently, showing her how to make the circular motion. On the second attempt, she produced something approximating a circle, wobbly and imperfect but recognizable. When she looked up at him, there was something new in her eyes. Wonder, maybe, or the first stirring of understanding that the world contained more than just survival and instinct. Over the following days, they continued these lessons. Jed would draw simple shapes and she would copy them. He would point to objects, table, chair, cup, fire, and name them repeatedly, hoping the words would eventually take root. Progress was slow, measured in tiny increments. But it was progress nonetheless. Rufus had become an unexpected ally. The old dog seemed to understand that something important was happening, and he'd taken to staying close to the girl. Sometimes she would reach out and touch his fur, gently, curiously. Rufus would stand patiently, his tail wagging slightly, but not everything was peaceful. On the 7th day since the confrontation with Cutter, Jed rode down to check his father's trap line and found every single trap destroyed. Not just sprung, deliberately smashed, the metal twisted and broken. And carved into a tree at the site was a message, "Last warning." Jed sat on his horse, staring at that message for a long time. The threat was clear. Cutter hadn't forgotten, and he wasn't going to let this go. When he returned to the cabin that evening, the girl was waiting on the porch with the pack. She took one look at his face and seemed to understand something was wrong. She made a questioning sound, a soft whine that her wolves echoed. "We've got trouble coming," he said quietly. "Those men, they're not going to stop. They'll come back, and when they do, there'll be more of them." He stopped himself. What was he doing? He was 63 years old, alone except for a feral girl and a pack of wolves. What chance did they have? But then, the girl did something that changed his thinking. She stood up, moved down the porch steps, and placed herself directly in front of him. Then she pointed at him, at herself, at the wolves arranged behind her. And she made a sound that was almost a word, a guttural, determined vocalization that seemed to mean together. Jed looked at her, at those fierce, wild eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't helpless. None of them were. They were survivors, all of them. Together, he repeated softly, and though he knew she couldn't fully understand the word, he thought perhaps she understood the intent. The promise. That night, as the fire burned low and the wolves slept, Jed sat awake thinking about choices and consequences. He'd chosen to protect this girl, and that choice had set events in motion he couldn't stop. Cutter would come back. There would be violence, but for the first time in 3 years, since Sarah had slipped away from him, Jed felt like his life meant something beyond just marking time until death. He had a purpose now, a reason to fight, to survive. It wasn't the future he'd imagined when he'd ridden up to this cabin, but it was a future nonetheless. And it was his to protect. The morning after discovering the warning, Jed woke with a plan forming in his mind. If Cutter and his men were going to come back, then he needed to be ready. That meant supplies, information, and teaching the girl enough that she could adapt if something happened to him. The girl had begun sleeping inside the cabin now, curled up near the fireplace with 2 of the younger wolves, while the rest of the pack kept watch outside. This morning she woke when Jed did, her senses attuned to his movements, even in sleep. "We're going on a ride today," Jed told her as he made coffee. "Down the mountain? There's someone I need to talk to." The girl watched him with those dark, evaluating eyes. She'd been learning fast. She now recognized maybe a dozen words. Fire, water, food, danger, wolf, dog, yes, no. It wasn't much, but it was a foundation. Jed saddled Copper and one of the mules. "This here's Copper," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's steady as they come. We're going to ride down to see a man named Horace Blackwell." The girl approached Copper cautiously, reaching out one hand to touch the mare's shoulder. Copper turned her head and snuffled at the girl's hair, and something like a smile flickered across the girl's face, brief as lightning but unmistakable. Getting her onto the mule took patience. She resisted at first, clearly uncomfortable with being carried by an animal. But Jed talked her through it, showed her how to sit, how to hold the reins. Eventually she settled, though she remained tense. They left Rufus and most of the pack at the cabin, taking only the grey alpha male who seemed determined to follow the girl. The wolf ranged ahead and behind as they rode, scouting the trail. The ride down took 3 hours. As they descended, the girl's tension increased. She made soft whining sounds, looking back toward the high country. Jed understood. Every step away from the wilderness was a step into a world that had never shown her kindness. Horace Blackwell's ranch sat in a wide valley where the mountains gave way to rolling grassland. Horace himself was in his 50s, a lean man with weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. He came out of the barn as they approached, rifle in hand, but held casually. "Jed Crane," he called out. "Didn't expect to see you again." Then his eyes found the girl, and his expression changed. Surprise, recognition, and something else. Fear, maybe. Lord above. "That's her, isn't it? The wild girl." Jed dismounted slowly. "She's under my protection now, and we've got a problem that concerns you." Over coffee in Horace's kitchen, the girl refused to come inside, staying on the porch with her wolf. Jed laid out what had happened. The confrontation with Cutter, the destroyed trap lines, the warning. Horace listened with a deepening frown. "Cutter's bad news," Horace said. "He and his boys have been causing trouble in Thornwood for years. The law turns a blind eye because Cutter's cousin is the deputy sheriff. So no help from that quarter," Jed said. "None." Horace refilled their cups. "But I can tell you this, Cutter's been recruiting men in town. Says there's a wild girl that needs catching, that she's dangerous. He's offering shares of bounty money." Jed felt ice settle in his stomach. "How many men?" "Last I heard, maybe 6 or 7 signed on. They're planning to come up after the first snow." "Figure you'll be easier to track then. The first snow. That could be any day now." Jed had a week at most, maybe 2 if they were lucky. "There's something else," Horace said, his voice dropping lower. "Talk in town is that the girl, she's not just any lost child. Word is, she's the daughter of a missionary couple that went missing 15 years ago. They were traveling through these mountains when they disappeared. Search parties found their wagon burned, no bodies. But if that girl is who I think she is, she'd have family," Jed finished. "People looking for her. People with rights to her," Horace corrected. "Legal rights." The missionaries had family back east, wealthy family, Jed understood. The girl wasn't just running from bounty hunters. She was potentially the missing heir to a family that might not care about what she'd become, only about blood and legacy. When Jed emerged from the house, he found the girl sitting on the porch steps, the grey wolf beside her. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw worry. She'd heard their voices through the door, even if she hadn't understood the words. Jed sat down beside her, close but not touching. For a moment, they just sat there, looking out at the valley spread below them. Finally, Jed spoke. "I want to teach you something." He pulled out a small leather pouch and opened it to reveal a handful of coins. "These are called money. Humans use them to trade, to get things they need." The girl picked up a silver dollar, turning it over in her hands, studying the embossed eagle. "But up here," Jed continued, pointing back toward the mountains, "you don't need money. You need to know how to read the land, how to find food, how to stay hidden. You already know these things, but I need you to know both ways, the wild way and the human way, because the world's going to come for you one way or another, and you need to be ready." The ride back up the mountain was quiet. The girl seemed lost in thought, occasionally touching the silver dollar Jed had let her keep. The wolf ranged wider now, more alert, perhaps sensing the tension. As they neared the cabin, the rest of the pack emerged from the trees to greet them. The girl slid off the mule and immediately dropped to all fours, moving among her wolves, touching them, making soft sounds. She was telling them something, Jed realized. Telling them about the danger coming. That night, Jed began preparations in earnest. He cleaned and oiled both his rifles, checked his ammunition stores, counted out what he had. Enough for a sustained fight, but not a long one. He reinforced the cabin door and shutters, and he began teaching the girl in earnest, not just words now, but concepts. Danger, hide, run, fight, stay, come. She learned with frightening speed, her mind sharp and adaptable. Within 3 days, she could follow simple commands, could understand basic warnings. She started making sounds that were almost words, rough, guttural approximations that showed she was trying to bridge the gap between wolf and human speech. But the most remarkable change was in her relationship with the wolves. When he demonstrated defensive positions around the cabin, she turned and made a series of sounds to the pack. The wolves responded, moving to the positions he'd indicated, learning them. She was preparing them too, preparing them for war. On the 10th day since the warning, the first snow fell. Not a light dusting, but a serious snowfall that laid down 4 inches by morning. The girl stood on the porch watching it fall, her expression unreadable. Jed wondered if she understood what this snow meant. That time was running out. That cutter would come soon. Soon, he said quietly. They'll come soon. The girl looked at him, then reached out and took his hand. Just for a moment. Then she released it and whistled, a sharp, clear sound that brought the pack running. Together, girl and wolves disappeared into the falling snow. Jed returned to his preparations, but his mind was heavy. Everything he'd built here, the fragile trust, the small progress, all of it was about to be tested, maybe destroyed. He wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, but then he remembered Sarah's words. Everything deserves a chance. Everything deserves someone to see it and care. He'd made his choice. Now he'd live with it, or die with it. Either way, he wouldn't be alone. The snow continued for 3 days, transforming the high country into a pristine white wilderness that was both beautiful and treacherous. Jed watched it accumulate with growing dread. Every inch that fell was another advantage for Cutter. Tracks would be impossible to hide, movements easy to follow, but the girl seemed to thrive in the snow. She moved through it with an ease that defied logic, her bare feet somehow impervious to the cold. She taught the wolves new patterns, new routes through the drifts, creating escape paths and fallback positions. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared to a brilliant blue. Jed stood on the porch when he saw something that made his breath catch. Smoke, a thin column rising from the forest about 2 miles down the mountain. Someone had made camp within striking distance. They're here, he said quietly. The girl appeared in the doorway moments later, the grey alpha beside her. She followed his gaze to the smoke, and her whole body went rigid. Jed turned to her. Those men, they're dangerous. They have guns and they know how to use them. If they get close, you run. You and the pack, you run deep into the high country. You understand? The girl's face hardened. She made a sound, a low, guttural vocalization that meant no. Then she pointed at him, at herself, at the cabin. Together, all right then. But we do this smart. No heroes, no unnecessary risks. Over the next hours, Jed positioned supplies at strategic points, ammunition, water, medical supplies. The girl directed the wolves to positions in the surrounding forest, creating a perimeter that would give them advance warning. She'd also begun doing something that fascinated Jed. Using a sharp stick, she'd drawn in the snow near the cabin, not random marks, but a crude map. The cabin in the center, the creek to the east, the game trail to the south, and marks that represented the wolves, positioned like sentries. She was thinking strategically, planning like a general. You're smarter than anyone gives you credit for, Jed said, studying her map. That afternoon, one of the younger wolves came racing back, whining urgently. The girl immediately went tense, making sounds to the pack. Within seconds, all the wolves had melted into the forest, invisible. Only the alpha remained, pressed low near the cabin. Jed grabbed his rifle and took position at the window. Then he saw movement. 3 men, maybe 400 yards out, working their way up through the trees. They were being cautious, using cover, but they'd made a mistake. They were following the most obvious path, and the girl had predicted exactly that. Jed watched as the lead man stepped forward and suddenly dropped through what looked like solid snow into a pit the girl had dug and covered 2 days ago. The man's shout echoed through the clear air. His companions rushed forward, and that's when the wolves struck. Not attacking, the girl had been clear about that, just harassing and frightening. The pack burst from cover on 3 sides, snarling and snapping but staying just out of reach. The men fired wildly, bullets hitting nothing. One man went down, slipped on ice in his panic, his rifle flying from his hands. The wolves pressed the advantage, circling, creating the illusion of being surrounded by dozens. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, the wolves vanished. The men were left in disarray, one still in the pit, one weaponless, all of them shaken. After a heated discussion, they retreated back down the mountain. Jed released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The girl appeared beside him at the window, and when he looked at her, he saw something fierce and satisfied in her expression. "That'll make them cautious," Jed said, "which buys us time. But it'll also make them angry. That night they didn't light a fire." The girl and her wolves huddled together for warmth, and after some hesitation, Jed joined them. It was strange, lying there surrounded by wild animals, but also oddly comforting. In the darkness, the girl reached out and found his hand. She held it for a long moment. Her way of saying thank you the next day brought a change in tactics. Instead of a direct approach, Cutter's men tried to draw them out. They positioned themselves in the forest and fired occasional shots toward the cabin, not trying to hit anything, just making noise, creating pressure. Jed ignored it. He kept the girl inside, kept her busy with lessons. He'd progressed to teaching her letters now. A, B, C. She learned them quickly, her finger tracing the shapes, her mouth forming sounds that were slowly becoming words. On the 3rd day of the siege, the shots stopped. The forest went quiet. It was more unnerving than the harassment had been. Jed watched from the window, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Then Rufus started growling, a low, continuous sound. The old dog was staring at the back wall, and Jed suddenly understood. They were trying to come through the roof. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the center of the cabin, aiming upward. Sure enough, he heard scraping sounds, the creak of weight on old shakes. They were trying to pull apart the roof. The girl heard it too. She made a sharp sound, and suddenly wolves were on the roof, snarling and snapping. Men shouted in alarm. There was a scuffle, the sound of bodies sliding on snow-covered shakes, a scream that cut off abruptly, then silence again. Minutes passed. Finally, Jed heard voices retreating through the forest, carrying someone who was moaning in pain. The wolves had driven them off again, but this time there'd been blood. When he finally opened the door to check, he found claw marks on the roof's edge and a trail of blood drops in the snow leading away. One of Cutter's men had been badly mauled. The girl stood beside Jed, looking at the blood trail. Her expression was complicated. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of grim acceptance. This was the cost of protection. "They'll be back," Jed said quietly. "And next time they'll come in force. They'll bring everyone they've got and try to end this all at once." The girl looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw understanding. The real fight was still ahead. That night, as they prepared for what tomorrow might bring, the girl did something she'd never done before. She spoke. Not a wolf sound, not a grunt or growl, but a word. Rough and unpracticed, but unmistakably human. "Jed," she said, pointing at him. Then she pointed at herself and made a questioning sound. Jed's throat tightened. She was asking for a name. Her name. Something that would make her more than just the girl. He thought for a moment, then remembered something Sarah had once said, talking about baby names they'd never gotten to use. "Luna," he said softly. "Your name is Luna. It means moon. Like the moon that's guided you all these years." Luna repeated the word. "Luna!" Then she pointed at him. "Jed." And she smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he'd known her. In that moment, despite everything, despite the danger, the coming violence, Jed felt something like hope. This girl was finding her way back to humanity. And maybe he was finding his way back too. The naming changed something between them. Luna became more present, more engaged with the human world Jed was trying to teach her. She repeated words constantly now, testing them on her tongue. Water, fire, snow, wolf, home. Each word was a small victory, a piece of her humanity reclaimed, but Jed knew their time was running short. It had been 2 days since the roof attack, 2 days of eerie quiet from the forest below. Cutter was regrouping, planning. The silence was heavy with threat. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jed made a decision. He couldn't just wait for the attack to come. He needed to understand what they were facing. "I'm going to scout their camp," he told Luna, pointing down the mountain. "You stay here. Keep the pack close. If I'm not back by sunset, you take the wolves and head deep into the high country." Luna's face darkened. She grabbed his arm, shaking her head. "No," she said. "Jed, no, I have to," he said gently. "We need to know what's coming." He took only his rifle and knife, moving through the forest with practiced silence. The snow had crusted over, making it easier to move quietly. He worked his way downhill, using cover, stopping frequently to listen. Cutter's camp was larger than expected. 8 men, maybe 9, gathered around 2 fires. They'd set up a proper base, tents, supplies, a makeshift corral. These men were prepared for an extended campaign. Jed settled behind a fallen log, watching. The men were organized, disciplined. Cutter moved among them, giving orders, and they responded with military efficiency. Then Jed saw something that made his blood run cold. 3 new men had arrived, leading pack mules loaded with equipment. Among that equipment were long metal tubes, dynamite. The plan became clear as he listened. They would surround the cabin, set charges at the foundation, then detonate them all at once. The cabin would collapse, killing or trapping anyone inside. Clean, efficient, and brutal. Jed began backing away slowly, careful not to make sound. He was maybe 50 yards from camp when his boot came down on a hidden branch. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "There!" someone shouted. In the trees, Jed ran. Behind him, men crashed through the forest. Bullets whipped through branches around him. His old legs protested, his lungs burned, but he didn't slow down. A wolf's howl split the air, the grey alpha, somewhere ahead. Then another howl and another. The pack had heard the gunfire and was coming. They understood. The pack materialized like grey ghosts, flowing past Jed toward his pursuers. He heard men shouting, more gunfire, snarling. The sounds of pursuit faded. Jed didn't stop until he reached the cabin. Luna was on the porch, Rufus beside her, both tense and ready. When she saw Jed, relief flooded her face. She rushed down, checking him over, making worried sounds. "I'm all right," Jed panted. "But we've got a problem. A big one." Inside, he explained what he'd seen. The numbers, the organization, the dynamite. Luna listened intently, her expression growing darker. When he finished, she was quiet, processing. Then she stood and moved to her snow map. She stared at it, thinking hard. Finally, she began drawing new marks, new positions. She was adapting their defenses, but Jed knew the truth. No amount of clever positioning would stop dynamite. They needed a different approach. "What if we don't wait for them to come to us?" Jed said slowly. "What if we hit them first? Tonight, while they think they have the advantage. Take out their supplies, scatter their horses." Luna looked at him, her eyes sharp and calculating. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. She understood a raid, a reversal of roles. Instead of prey, they would become predators. They spent the afternoon planning. Jed would go in on foot, using darkness and stealth. He'd target the dynamite first. Luna and the pack would create diversions, draw attention away, then extract him when the job was done. It was risky, reckless even, but it was better than sitting in the cabin waiting to be blown apart. As darkness fell, Jed made his preparations. He blackened his face with charcoal, dressed in dark clothing, checked his weapons. Luna watched him with worry. When he was ready, she approached and placed something in his hand, the silver dollar he'd given her. "Luna," he protested, but she closed his fingers around it, holding his hand between both of hers. "Jed," she said softly. "Come back!" His throat tight, Jed nodded. "I will. I promise." The descent through the dark forest was treacherous. Jed moved by feel and memory, every sense straining. The wolves ranged ahead, invisible scouts marking the safe path. When he reached the edge of Cutter's camp, he found chaos. Luna had already begun her diversion. Wolves circled the camp, howling that eerie, spine-chilling sound. The horses were panicking. Men were shouting, firing into darkness. Jed used the confusion. He slipped through the perimeter until he reached the supply tent. Inside, he found crates marked with warning symbols. The dynamite. He worked quickly, prying open crates with his knife. Then he took the sticks of dynamite and scattered them into the forest, throwing them as far as he could in different directions. Without the blasting caps, they were relatively stable, but Cutter's men would have a hell of a time finding them. He was on his last crate when a voice behind him said, "Well now, looks like the old man's got some fight in him after all." Jed turned slowly. Cutter stood in the tent entrance, rifle leveled. In the firelight, his bearded face was twisted with anger. "That was clever," Cutter said. "But it ends tonight. You're gonna tell me where that girl is?" Jed didn't answer. His rifle was too far to reach. His pistol was holstered, but Cutter's finger was on the trigger. Any move would be his last. Then, from the darkness outside, came a sound that froze them both. Not a wolf howl, a human voice, wild and fierce. "Jed!" Luna burst into the camp like a force of nature, the grey alpha beside her and the rest of the pack flowing behind. She moved with speed and ferocity that was purely animal, but her eyes were all human, focused and determined. Cutter swung his rifle toward her, and Jed didn't think. He lunged forward, knocking the barrel aside just as it fired. The bullet went wide. Then the tent erupted in chaos. Wolves everywhere, snarling and snapping, and men screaming. Jed grabbed his rifle and Luna's arm. "Run!" he shouted. "Now!" They ran together, human and half-wild girl and pack of wolves, fleeing into darkness with gunfire chasing them. They didn't stop until they'd put a mile between them and the camp. Only then did Jed allow himself to breathe. Luna was beside him, her chest heaving, her eyes bright with triumph. She'd saved him. She'd come into a human camp, faced guns and fire, and she'd saved him. "You didn't have to do that," Jed said quietly. "You should have stayed safe." Luna looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something profound. "Together," she said. The word was clear, final. She'd made her choice, just as he'd made his. They would face this together, or not at all. The raid had bought them time, but both Jed and Luna knew it wouldn't be enough. Cutter would be furious now, humiliated in front of his men. He'd come back harder, meaner, more determined. The question wasn't if, but when. They spent the next 2 days fortifying the cabin and preparing. Jed taught Luna how to load and fire his spare rifle. Her hands awkward at first, but quickly adapting. She was a natural shot, her predator's instincts translating seamlessly to aiming and firing. Within hours, she could hit targets at 50 yards, but on the morning of the 3rd day, something unexpected happened that would change everything. Jed was outside splitting wood when Rufus began barking. Not his alarm bark, but something different, confused almost. Jed grabbed his rifle and moved to investigate, Luna falling in beside him. Together, they approached the edge of the clearing where Rufus stood, tail wagging uncertainly. Staring at something in the trees, a woman stepped into view. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in practical traveling clothes that had seen hard use. Her face was weathered but kind, framed by dark hair streaked with grey. She held her hands up, showing she was unarmed, but her eyes were fixed on Luna with an intensity that made Jed's skin prickle. "Please," the woman said, her voice shaking. "Please don't shoot. I'm not with Cutter's men. I'm looking for my niece. My sister's child. She was lost in these mountains 15 years ago, when she was just a baby. Her name was Elizabeth." Luna had gone completely still beside Jed, her rifle lowered, but her body tense. She was staring at the woman with an expression Jed had never seen before, part recognition, part fear. The woman took a hesitant step forward. "I've been searching for so long. My sister and her husband were missionaries, traveling through to the territories. Their wagon was attacked. We found it burned, but no bodies. Everyone assumed they were dead, that Elizabeth was taken or killed. But there were stories over the years. Trappers talking about a wild child in the mountains. A girl who ran with wolves." She stopped, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Luna. "You have your mother's eyes, Elizabeth. My God, you're alive." Jed felt the world tilt. This was the peace Horace had mentioned. Luna wasn't just a wild girl with no past. She was someone's daughter, someone's niece. She belonged to a family that had mourned her, searched for her. "How did you find us?" Jed asked. "I heard about Cutter's hunt, about a wild girl in the high country, and an old trapper protecting her. I came as fast as I could. I'm Margaret Hayes. Your mother was my sister Elizabeth. Your aunt—" Luna made a sound, a low, confused whine that was pure animal. She looked at Jed, her eyes pleading for him to make sense of this. He could see the war raging inside her, the pull of blood, of family, against the life she knew, the wilderness that had raised her. "Ma'am," Jed said carefully, "your niece has been living wild for 15 years. She barely speaks. She doesn't remember anything about being human. The wolves raised her. She's my blood," Margaret interrupted, her voice fierce. "She's all I have left of my sister. I have a home in Boston, money, education waiting for her. She can have a real life, not this existence." Luna suddenly moved, backing away from both of them, shaking her head. "No," she said, the word desperate. "No, home here, Jed, wolves, home." Margaret's face crumpled. "Please, I'm your family. Your mother loved you so much. She sang to you every night. She called you her little moonbeam. That's why I brought this." She reached into her coat slowly and pulled out something small and worn. A music box. She opened it, and a delicate melody filled the clearing, a lullaby sweet and haunting. And as it played, something extraordinary happened. Luna's expression changed. Her eyes went distant, unfocused. Tears began streaming down her face, tears she didn't seem to understand. "You remember?" Margaret breathed. "Somewhere inside you remember." But Luna was shaking her head, backing away, making sounds of distress that brought the grey alpha rushing to her side. The wolf positioned himself between Luna and Margaret, growling low. The rest of the pack materialized from the forest. Jed understood the problem. Luna was being torn in two, the human part responding to that music, to some buried memory, while the wild part screamed that this woman was a threat. "This isn't the way," Jed said to Margaret. "You can't just expect her to leave everything behind." "She needs time." A gunshot cracked through the air. The music box exploded in Margaret's hand, pieces scattering across the snow. Margaret screamed, clutching her bleeding hand. Jed spun, rifle raised, and saw them, Cutter and his men, 6 of them, emerging from the tree line with weapons drawn. "Well now," Cutter said, satisfaction in his voice. "Looks like we've got ourselves a family reunion. And lucky for you, Mrs. Hayes, you're just in time to watch us bring your wild niece to justice." Jed's mind raced. They'd been distracted by Margaret's revelation, let their guard down. Cutter must have been tracking her, using her as bait. Now they were surrounded, caught in the open with nowhere to run. "There doesn't need to be violence," Margaret said, trying to stanch the bleeding. "I'll pay you, Cutter. Whatever bounty you were promised, I'll double it." "Just let her go," Cutter laughed. "This ain't about money anymore, lady. This is about respect. That old man and his pet savages have made fools of us long enough. We're taking the girl, collecting our bounty, and putting down those wolves." Jed felt Luna press against his side, felt her trembling. The wolves were ranged around them, sensing the threat but waiting for her signal. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Then Margaret did something surprising. She stepped forward, placing herself between Cutter's men and Luna. "No," she said firmly. "I came to find my niece, and I'm not leaving without her. But I'm not letting you hurt her either. That girl is the last piece of my sister I have left. She's family, and family protects family." Nobody moved. Cutter looked genuinely confused. "Lady, you're either brave or stupid," Cutter said. "Either way, you're in the way." "Then you'll have to go through me," Margaret said quietly. "And I promise you, there will be consequences. I have lawyers, resources, connections. You kill me or harm my niece, and you'll hang for it. The law might turn a blind eye to your usual thuggery, but not murder of a woman from a prominent Boston family." Jed saw the calculation in Cutter's eyes. The man was weighing whether the satisfaction of revenge was worth the legal complications Margaret was threatening. The standoff held for a long moment. Then Luna did something that changed everything. She stepped forward, past both Jed and Margaret, and stood alone in the space between the two groups. She looked at Cutter, at his men, at the rifles pointed at her. Then she looked back at Margaret, at Jed, at her wolves, and she made a choice. She pointed at Cutter and his men. Then she pointed at herself and made a gesture, a clear, unmistakable offer. She was offering herself in exchange for everyone else's safety. She would surrender if they would leave Jed and Margaret and the wolves alone. "No!" Jed shouted, moving toward her. "Luna, no!" But she held up a hand, stopping him. "Jed," she said, tears in her eyes, but her voice steady. "Family, protect family." She'd learned that from him. She'd learned about sacrifice, about protecting those you love. And now she was using that lesson to save him. Margaret was crying openly. "Elizabeth, no, please." But Luna was already walking toward Cutter, her hands raised in surrender. The wolves howled, a sound of loss and grief and fury, but Luna made a sharp gesture, and they stayed back. She wouldn't let them die for her. Cutter grinned, triumph on his face. "Now that's more like it. Come on then, girl." As Cutter's men moved forward to take Luna, Jed felt something break inside him. He'd failed. He'd promised to protect her, and now she was being taken from him. But as Luna passed by Margaret, something extraordinary happened. The wild girl reached out and took the older woman's uninjured hand, squeezing it gently. Then she said something, just 2 words, rough and unpracticed, but clear enough. "Aunt Margaret," she remembered. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the wild exterior, a little girl named Elizabeth still existed. And she was reaching out, trying to bridge the impossible gap between the life she'd lived and the life she'd lost. Margaret sobbed, clutching Luna's hand. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm your Aunt Margaret." Then Cutter's men were pulling Luna away, binding her wrists, leading her toward the forest. The wolves howled, Rufus barked frantically, and Jed stood frozen, watching the girl he'd come to love like a daughter disappear into the trees. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, something else stirred in his chest. Luna had made her choice to protect them. Now it was his turn. He'd let her go once. He wouldn't let her go twice. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment Cutter and his men disappeared into the forest with Luna, Jed's paralysis broke. He turned to Margaret, who was still clutching her bleeding hand, tears streaming down her face. "How long have they been tracking you?" he demanded. "I don't know. Maybe since I left Thornwood. I hired a guide, but he disappeared 2 days ago. I thought he just abandoned me. But if Cutter found him first, he used you," Jed said, his voice hard. "Led you right to us, knowing we'd drop our guard. Damn it." He looked at the forest where Luna had vanished. "We're going after her now. We." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "I thought you were you barely know her." "I know her better than anyone," Jed said quietly. "And she's family now, my family. Same as she's yours." He moved toward the cabin. "Can you ride?" "Yes, but my hand—" "I'll bandage it." "We don't have time for anything fancy." Jed was already moving, his mind shifting into a mode he hadn't accessed in decades. The tactical thinking of a younger man who'd fought in the Mexican War, who'd survived battles and ambushes and desperate situations. That man was still in there beneath the grief and the years, and he was waking up now. Inside the cabin, Jed worked quickly, cleaning and binding Margaret's wounded hand while explaining what they were up against. "Cutter's got 6 men, maybe 7. They're well armed and they know this country. But they've also got a prisoner to guard and manage, which slows them down. And they don't know about the wolves." "The wolves," Margaret repeated. "They'll follow her, won't they?" "Count on it." Jed finished the bandage and began loading supplies into his pack. Ammunition, dried food, water, medical supplies, rope. Everything they might need for a rescue that could go a dozen different ways. The pack won't let her go without a fight. "And neither will I." He pulled out a second rifle and handed it to Margaret. "You know how to use this?" She took it, checked the action with practiced ease. "My father taught me. We lived in Montana Territory before we moved east. I'm not helpless, Mr. Crane." "Jed," he corrected. "And I can see that." He respected her more for that. She'd come into the wilderness alone, searching for a niece she'd never known was alive, and she'd stood up to armed men without flinching. Sarah would have liked her, he thought, Outside, the grey alpha was waiting. The wolf looked at Jed with those intelligent eyes, and Jed understood. The pack was ready. They'd been tracking Luna since the moment she was taken, staying hidden but close, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Can you talk to them?" Margaret asked, staring at the wolf with a mixture of awe and nervousness. "Not like Luna can, but we understand each other well enough." Jed moved to Copper and began saddling her. "They'll lead us to where Cutter's taking her. Then we'll figure out how to get her back." They rode out within the hour, following the grey alpha through the forest. The wolf moved at a steady lope, occasionally stopping to make sure they were following, his nose never far from the ground. The trail Cutter's men had left was easy to follow. Broken branches, trampled snow, the occasional drop of blood from Margaret's wounded hand that had dripped before Cutter bound it. But more than that, Jed could read the story in the tracks. Luna was fighting them. Not violently, she was too smart for that. Knew it would only get her hurt, but she was being deliberately difficult. Walking slow, stumbling, forcing them to half-carry her at times. She was buying time, he realized, giving him a chance to catch up, believing somehow that he would come for her. "She trusts you," Margaret said quietly, reading the same signs. "She barely knows me, but she trusts you completely. I was the first human who didn't try to hurt her," Jed said. "That builds a bond, and maybe," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe we both needed each other. I was dying up here, just waiting for my life to end. She gave me a reason to live again, and I gave her, I don't know, safety maybe, a bridge back to humanity. I'm not trying to take her from that," Margaret said. "I need you to understand that. I want her to have choices, to know she has family that loves her, a home if she wants it. But I'm not trying to cage her. I've seen what she is, how she lives. I won't destroy that," Jed nodded. He believed her. He could see in Margaret the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to stand against Cutter. "She'll need both," he said. "Both worlds, the wild and the tame. That's who she is now." They tracked through the afternoon, the grey alpha leading them higher into the mountains rather than down toward the valley. That puzzled Jed at first, until he realized what Cutter was doing. The man wasn't taking Luna to Thornwood. He was heading to an old mining camp on the far side of the range, a place that had been abandoned for years. Isolated, defensible, far from any law or witnesses. Whatever Cutter was planning, he wanted privacy for it. As the sun began to set, the alpha led them to a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. There, in the gathering darkness, Jed could see the old mining camp, a cluster of dilapidated buildings, a few still standing, most collapsed to rotting timber, and in the center a fire burning, casting dancing shadows. Cutter's camp. Jed pulled out his spyglass and surveyed the scene. 7 men around the fire, passing a bottle. And there, tied to a post outside what looked like an old assay office, was Luna. Even from this distance, he could see she was unhurt, but her posture spoke of exhaustion and despair. The wolves must have seen her too, because soft whining sounds began echoing through the pack that had gathered on the ridge. 10 wolves now, maybe more, the entire family coming together. "We can't just charge in there," Margaret said, studying the layout. "They'll see us coming from any direction." "No, we can't." Jed was thinking, planning, using skills he'd thought were rusted beyond use. "But we don't have to. We just need to create enough chaos that they can't coordinate a defense. The wolves can do that." He looked at the grey alpha, and the wolf looked back. An understanding passed between them, not words, but something deeper, a shared purpose. The pack would attack from 3 sides at once, creating panic and confusion. In that chaos, Jed and Margaret would slip in, cut Luna free, and extract her before Cutter could organize a response. It was risky, desperate even. Men would likely die, maybe including himself. But Jed had made his peace with death 3 years ago when Sarah passed. He'd been living on borrowed time ever since. If this was how it ended, fighting for someone who mattered, for a cause worth dying for, well, there were worse ways to go. "When?" Margaret asked, full dark. "Another hour." Jed checked his rifle one more time, made sure his pistol was loaded and ready. "We go in quiet, stay low, move fast. The wolves will keep them busy." We get to Luna, cut her free, and we run. Don't stop, don't look back, just run. The pack will cover our retreat, and if something goes wrong..." Jed met her eyes. "Then we improvise. But we don't leave without her. No matter what," Margaret nodded.
"No matter what?"
They waited as darkness fell, watching the camp below. The men grew louder as the bottle passed around, their vigilance slipping with each drink. Jed counted that as a small blessing. Drunk men made mistakes, got sloppy, but they were also unpredictable, potentially more violent. He watched Luna, saw her testing her bonds, working at the ropes with a patience and persistence that was purely wolf. She was trying to free herself, hadn't given up hope. That gave him strength. As the last light faded from the sky and stars began emerging overhead, Jed turned to the grey alpha. He pointed at the camp, made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the 3 directions of attack he'd identified. The wolf watched him, head tilted, processing. Then it turned to the pack and made a series of sounds. Not howls, but something more complex. Communication. The pack split into 3 groups, each moving to a different position around the camp. They were coordinating, Jed realized with awe. Luna had taught them tactics, strategy, how to work together in ways wolves didn't normally operate. She'd made them more than a pack. She'd made them an army. "They're ready," Margaret whispered, checking her rifle one final time. "So are we." Jed looked at the woman beside him, a stranger just hours ago, now an ally in a desperate fight. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for caring about her, for being willing to fight for her. She's family," Margaret said simply. "That's what family does." The grey alpha looked back at Jed, waiting for the signal. Jed took a deep breath, felt his heart steady, felt the old combat calm settle over him, that strange clarity that came before violence, when everything slowed down and sharpened into crystal focus. He raised his hand, held it there for 1 heartbeat, 2, then dropped it, and the night exploded into chaos. The wolves hit from 3 sides at once, their howls shattering the quiet like breaking glass. Men shouted in alarm, scrambling for weapons. The fire scattered as bodies crashed through it. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like lightning, and in the midst of it all, Jed and Margaret moved like ghosts, slipping down the ridge and into the camp, heading for the spot where Luna was tied, their entire world narrowing to one objective: get to her. Get her free, get her home. The real fight was just beginning. The chaos was absolute. Wolves everywhere, shadows moving with deadly purpose, their snarls creating terror that sent Cutter's men into blind panic. Jed had seen men face combat before. Some held their nerve, others broke. These men were breaking. One of Cutter's men fired wildly, hitting nothing. A wolf darted in, snapping at his legs, driving him backward into another man. They went down in a tangle. Another man was backed against a building, swinging his rifle like a club as 2 wolves circled him. Through it all, Jed and Margaret moved low and fast, using buildings for cover. Jed's heart hammered, not from fear, but from the clarity that came when only the mission mattered. Get to Luna. They were 20 yards from where she was tied when Cutter stepped into their path. The man's face was twisted with fury, his rifle aimed at Jed's chest. "I should have known. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you, old man?" "Let her go, Cutter," Jed said. "This is done. You've lost. Take your men and walk away." "Lost?" Cutter laughed bitterly. "That girl's worth $200 to the right buyers. Folks in the territories pay good money for curiosities like her. Put her in a show, teach her tricks." The casual cruelty ignited something hot in Jed's chest. "Over my dead body. That can be arranged." The shot came from Jed's left, Margaret firing before Cutter could. The bullet took Cutter in the shoulder, spinning him around. He went down hard, clutching the wound. "That's for the music box," Margaret said coldly, already moving past him toward Luna. Jed followed, covering their backs as Margaret reached Luna and began sawing at the ropes with her knife. Luna held perfectly still, her eyes scanning the chaos, tracking threats. Behind them, Cutter struggled to his feet, reaching for the pistol at his belt with his good hand. Jed turned, and their eyes met. Then a grey shape exploded from the darkness, the Alpha launching himself at Cutter with pure fury. They went down together, rolling through scattered fire. "Jed!" Margaret shouted. "She's free!" Luna was up, rubbing her raw wrists. She saw the alpha struggling with Cutter and threw back her head, letting out a howl, not quite wolf, not quite human, carrying command and urgency. The pack responded instantly. The alpha released Cutter and bounded toward Luna. The other wolves broke off their attacks, racing to converge on their leader. Within seconds, they were moving as one unit, flowing toward the camp's edge. "Go!" Jed shouted to Margaret. "Follow them! I'll cover you!" Margaret ran after Luna and the wolves. Jed stood his ground, rifle raised, scanning for threats. Cutter was down, wounded. 2 of his men were injured, the others scattered and disoriented. They'd come expecting an easy capture, not a war. Jed began backing toward the edge of camp. He was almost clear when he heard the click of a hammer being cocked. "Not so fast, old man." A wiry man with a scarred face had recovered his rifle and was aiming it at Jed's chest. His hands were steady, his stance professional. "This one was a killer. You cost us a lot tonight," the man said calmly. "I figure that's worth at least 1 bullet." Jed calculated his chances. His rifle was pointed the wrong direction. His pistol was holstered. He'd never make it in time. This was it, the end he'd been half expecting. At least Luna was safe. But before the man could fire, something small and fast crashed into him from the side. Rufus, loyal, aging Rufus, had his teeth sunk deep into the man's leg. The shot went wild, the bullet whining past Jed's ear. The man screamed, trying to shake off the dog, but Rufus held on with determination. Jed didn't waste the opening. He swung his rifle around and fired, the bullet taking the man in the leg. The man collapsed, and Rufus finally released, limping back to Jed's side. The old dog was panting hard, favoring his right leg, but his tail wagged. "Good boy," Jed said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good boy, Rufus. Let's get out of here." They ran together through the darkness, following the sounds of wolves ahead. Behind them, the mining camp was devastation. Scattered fires, wounded men, ruined plans. Jed didn't look back. He found Margaret and Luna waiting in a stand of trees about a quarter mile from camp. Luna rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce hug. Her whole body trembled, not from fear, but from relief. She pulled back and looked at him. "Jed," she said, thick with emotion. "Jed's safe. I'm safe," he confirmed. "We're all safe." Margaret was reloading her rifle with shaking hands. "Is it over?" she asked. "For tonight," Jed said. "But we need to keep moving. Put distance between us and them. Gutter's hurt, but wounded animals are the most dangerous kind. We need to be long gone before morning." They traveled through the night, pushing hard despite exhaustion, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the mining camp. The wolves ranged ahead and behind, alert for pursuit. Luna moved between her 2 worlds with fluid ease, sometimes on 2 legs beside Jed and Margaret, sometimes on all 4s running with the pack. Jed's body was screaming at him. His knees ached, his back protested every step, and there was a sharp pain in his chest that he told himself was just exertion. He was 63 years old, and he'd just fought a battle that would have challenged men half his age. But he kept moving because stopping meant being caught. Margaret was struggling too. Her wounded hand had to be throbbing, and she wasn't accustomed to this kind of sustained hardship. But she never complained, never asked to rest. She just kept moving, her jaw set with determination that reminded Jed of Sarah. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky, they reached a small box canyon with a narrow entrance, defensible and hidden. Jed had discovered it weeks ago while checking trap lines. "Here," he said, his voice hoarse. "We'll rest here. The wolves can watch the entrance. We'll be safe for a few hours." They collapsed inside the canyon, all of them, humans and wolves alike, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Luna immediately went to check on each member of her pack, examining them for injuries. 2 of the younger wolves had minor wounds from the fight. Nothing serious, but enough that they needed attention. Jed watched as Luna tended to her family with remarkable gentleness. She used techniques he'd taught her, cleaning wounds with snow, applying pressure, combined with wolf behaviors of licking and nuzzling. She was truly both now, he realized. Not human trying to be wolf, or wolf trying to be human, but something unique. Something beautiful. "She's remarkable," Margaret said softly, sitting beside Jed. "I've been watching her, trying to understand." "She's not what I expected. Not damaged or broken, just different. Whole in a way I didn't think was possible." "She's had to be," Jed said. "The wilderness doesn't forgive weakness. She survived because she's strong, adaptable, intelligent." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Then what happens now? After we're safe, what happens to her?" Jed had been avoiding that question. "That's not my choice to make. It's hers. But she's still a child. She's 16, maybe 17 years old," Jed interrupted gently. "And she's been making her own choices for most of those years. We can offer her options, show her possibilities. But we can't cage her. We can't force her into a life she doesn't want." "I don't want to cage her," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just want her to know she has a home, a family. That she doesn't have to be alone." "She's not alone," Jed said, gesturing at the wolves. "She never was. But I understand what you mean. And I think there's a way for her to have both. Your world and this one." Luna finished tending to the wolves and came to sit with them. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with dirt and smoke, her clothes torn, but her eyes were clear and steady. She'd been through a crucible tonight and come through it stronger. She looked at Jed, then at Margaret, then reached out and took both their hands, joining them together in her own. It was a deliberate gesture, symbolic. She was choosing both of them, both worlds. "Family," she said, the word clear and certain. Then she pointed at the wolves. "Family." She pointed at Jed. "Family." She pointed at Margaret. "Family." Her hand moved to encompass all of them, human and wolf, wild and tame. "All family." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached out slowly and touched the girl's face. "Yes," she whispered, "all family. All of us." For a moment they sat there in the growing dawn light, 3 humans and a wolf pack, refugees from violence, bound together by choice and something deeper than blood. The morning was cold, the danger not yet past, the future uncertain. But in that moment there was peace. Rufus limped over and collapsed against Jed's leg with a satisfied groan. The old dog had earned his rest. Jed stroked his head, grateful beyond words. "We should sleep," Jed said. "A few hours at least. The wolves will keep watch. Then we'll figure out our next move." "What about Cutter?" Margaret asked. "He's hurt. His men scattered. We broke them tonight. With you threatening legal consequences, Cutter knows when to cut his losses." Luna curled up between them, using Margaret's coat as a pillow, and within minutes she was asleep. The wolves arranged themselves in a protective circle. Margaret leaned back against the canyon wall and closed her eyes. Jed stayed awake a while longer, keeping watch, thinking about everything that had happened. 2 months ago, he'd been a man waiting to die. Now he was part of something larger than himself, a family that crossed all boundaries. Sarah would have loved this, he thought. Would have loved Luna, would have understood what the girl was. "I kept my promise," Jed whispered to the morning air, to Sarah's memory. "I went and lived. Found something worth fighting for. Found family again." In the way the light touched the canyon walls, in the peaceful breathing of Luna sleeping between him and Margaret, in the warmth of Rufus pressed against his leg, he felt an answer, a sense of rightness, of beginning again. When Jed finally allowed himself to sleep, his dreams were peaceful for the first time in 3 years. And when he woke, the sun was high, Luna was sitting with the wolves, and Margaret was making coffee over a small fire. It looked like home. It felt like family. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Jed felt like he'd found his way back to living. 3 weeks had passed since that night at the mining camp. 3 weeks of healing, of learning, of figuring out what came next. They'd returned to the cabin. Jed, Margaret, Luna, Rufus, and the wolf pack. The small structure that had once been Jed's refuge from grief had become something else entirely, a bridge between worlds. The first snow of true winter had fallen the night before, blanketing everything in pristine white. Jed stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching Luna work with the wolves in the clearing. She was teaching them something, and the pack followed her lead with absolute trust. Margaret emerged from the cabin, wrapped in one of Jed's old coats. Her hand had healed well, though she'd carry a scar from where Cutter's bullet had destroyed the music box. She said she didn't mind it, said it reminded her of the night she'd found her niece. She's going to stay, isn't she? Margaret said quietly. Here in the mountains. Part of the time, Jed said. She's agreed to spend winters down in Thornwood with Horace Blackwell's family. Luna can learn to read and write properly, learn more about human ways. But come spring, she'll return here, Margaret finished. To the high country. To her wolves, yes. Jed watched Luna laugh, a sound that still surprised him every time. She needs both. The wild keeps her strong, keeps her who she is. But she needs the human world too. It's not one or the other anymore. It's both. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then I'm going to buy property near Blackwell's ranch. Build a house there. A place where she can come whenever she wants, where the wolves are welcome. I can't take her back to Boston, I see that now. But I can bring Boston's resources here. Jed smiled. Sarah would have liked you. She always believed there was more than one way to be family. I wish I could have met her. Me too. Jed's chest tightened, but it was the good kind of ache now. But in a way, she's part of all this. She taught me that everything deserves a chance, that everything deserves someone to see it and care. Luna noticed them watching and waved. She said something to the pack, and they settled into resting positions while she jogged over to the porch. Jed, she said, her vocabulary expanding daily. Margaret, come. Want to show you something. They followed her into the forest, Luna leading with sure steps, the grey alpha beside her. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, until they reached a small clearing that opened up to reveal a view of the entire valley below. In the distance, smoke rose from Thornwood. Behind them, the high peaks where the wolves roamed free. Luna pointed at the valley. Human world, she said. Then she pointed at the peaks. Wolf world. Finally, she pointed at the clearing where they stood. Luna world. Both. Together. It was the most complex thought Jed had heard her express, and it was perfect. She understood exactly what she'd become. Not human, not wolf, but something new. Something that belonged to both worlds. Yes, Jed said, his voice thick. Luna world. Both together. Margaret knelt down, so she was at eye level with Luna. Your mother would be so proud of you. She loved these mountains. She loved the wild things. She would understand what you've become. Luna reached into the leather pouch she wore around her neck and pulled out two objects. One was the silver dollar Jed had given her, worn smooth from handling. The other was a small piece of the music box, a fragment showing part of a woman's face, her mother's face. She held them both up, one in each hand. Jed family, she said, indicating the coin. Margaret family, she said, holding up the porcelain fragment. Luna keep both, always. Margaret pulled Luna into a hug, and this time Luna didn't stiffen or pull away. She hugged back, her arms wrapping around her aunt with strength and certainty. Jed turned away to give them privacy, his own eyes burning. The grey alpha approached and pressed his head briefly against Jed's hand before returning to Luna's side. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, there was a knock at the door. Horace Blackwell stood outside, hat in hand. Heard you folks were back, he said. Wanted to let you know, Cutter and his boys cleared out. Went south. Won't be bothering anyone in these parts again. Good, Jed said. Come in, have some coffee. Over coffee and dinner they finalized the plans. Luna would spend winters at the Blackwell Ranch, learning and growing, with the understanding that she could return to the high country whenever she needed. The wolves would be welcome on Blackwell's land. Margaret would build her house and split her time between Montana and Boston. She'd set up a trust for Luna's education and future, but the money was Luna's to use as she saw fit. Not a leash to control her, and Jed would stay in his cabin, working his trap lines, living the life he'd come here to find. But it wouldn't be a life of solitary grief anymore. It would be a life of purpose, of family, of knowing that come spring, a wild girl and her wolves would return, and he'd be there waiting. As evening drew to a close and Horace headed back down the mountain, Jed stood on the porch one more time, looking up at the stars. Luna came to stand beside him, the grey alpha on her other side. Jed, Luna said eventually. Thank you. For see Luna, for care, Jed's throat was too tight to speak, so he just put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, this girl who'd been raised by wolves, who'd learned to be human without losing her wild heart. "Thank you," he said finally, "for giving an old man a reason to live again." They stood there under the stars, surrounded by family both human and wolf, in a cabin at the edge of the wilderness where two worlds met. Jed thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to her, of the journey that had brought him here. He'd come to these mountains to die. Instead, he'd learned to live. And in teaching a wild girl about humanity, he'd rediscovered his own. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not a sound of loneliness, but of belonging, of home, and Jed, for the first time in 3 years, felt completely at peace.